Okay, I think we're live now. Good afternoon, everyone. It is 2 o'clock, just 8 minutes past 2, and I'd like to welcome everybody to this panel titled Just Enough for the City. And we're about to have a robust discussion. And before I start, I'd like to just inform everybody that this is a nonpartisan event, and we ask that you refrain from making any partisan commentary. I will start by saying that my name is Johanna Fernandez, and I'm a professor of history at Baruch College of the City University of New York. And I'd like to thank the organizers of this conference. This is a moment for us to really take the reins of history into our hands and commit ourselves to being full members of our society. This is a moment of possibility in all kinds of different ways. And I'd like to thank especially Kim Westcott for her tenacity and for bringing me into this conversation, and just the preparation for this conversation has been incredibly rich. The conversations that the panelists have had amongst each other as we think about what to bring to you today. And I just want to offer a brief introduction and context for our conversation. We're talking about structural displacement in this panel, but also the possibilities for reimagining the city. And I think we have to say that deep, unforeseen structural displacement began to grip New York City in the period immediately after World War II, when there was a shift in the structure of the economy from industry to service. And this is something that was happening here in New York City, but in other cities like Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia. It was during this period that industrial factories began a slow migration out of the city and into the suburbs in stages. And the process turned, for example, parts of the Bronx into a decaying strip of decrepit industrial land. This development alarmed the Bureau of Labor Statistics in 1966, which began to document a new development in urban history, and that is pockets of permanently unemployed Black American and Puerto Rican migrants to the city in that period. So this is this crisis of displacement in employment begins after World War II, and it produces joblessness, a kind of displacement. But the period also saw displacement in housing. The gentrification of that earlier period was known as urban renewal. We saw the tearing down of entire neighborhoods like Lincoln Center, for example, during this period, which was a thriving Puerto Rican community, and 22,000 families were displaced to build Lincoln Center. And we also know that there was a very complex network of highways that were built during this period of the post-World War II period that also displaced entire neighborhoods. One of our guests, Dr. Mindy Fullilove, she's going to join us at 3 o'clock, has written about displacement. And displacement comes in many forms, in the form of job displacement, housing displacement, the uprooting of communities, but also migration. Migration is a kind of displacement that produces profound traumas. And folks in New York, many of whom are migrants to the city, are intimately acquainted with the difficulties of migration. But this is what Dr. Mindy Fullilove says about displacement, which she calls root shock. Root shock, she explains, undermines trust, increases anxiety, destabilizes relationships, destroys social, emotional, and financial resources, and increases the risk of every kind of stress-related disease, from depression to heart attack. So displacement is this complex phenomenon that has consequences for our communities, for our health, for the health of the city, that are really incalculable. And part of what we're going to talk about this afternoon is what are the structural roots of that displacement, and what can we do to make our city a city that is healthier? What can we do to keep and support the integrity of our city and the people who live in it? Just finally, I'll say that housing is a big problem before us in the country. 40 million people at least are facing displacement. And just this year, there was a report which said that since 2013, there have been more than 25 million applications submitted to the affordable housing lottery in New York. 25 million applications, but the city only has roughly 40,000 units. So that gives you a sense of the need before us. And so what we will do for the rest of this discussion is that I will introduce our panelists briefly, and I will ask them to introduce themselves, but also I'd like to know, and certainly the audience would like to know, what is it that brings you to this work personally? What are the personal origins of your commitment to the work you do? And then we're going to have a conversation about structures of displacement. We'll follow that by the category of impact. What's the impact of displacement on the people of the city? And then we'll end with a conversation that attempts to re-envision our city and explore possibilities for remaking our city anew. Our guests today, our speakers, are quite distinguished. We bring to this conversation Peggy Shepard, who's a co-founder and executive director of We Act. We also have Yolande Nicholson, who's an attorney, and she's the president of the New York State Foreclosure Defense Bar. She'll talk to us about her work. We are also joined by the Deputy Mayor, Phillip Thompson, Deputy Mayor for Strategic Policy Initiatives here in the city. And later on at 3, we're going to be joined by Dr. Mindy Fullilove, who is a social psychiatrist and professor of urban policy. So without further ado, I'd like for both of you to tell us a little bit more about the work you do. But in this moment, when we are connecting increasingly to our humanity because of the pandemic, we'd like to know, what is it that brings you personally to this work? Let's start with Peggy Shepard.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Really glad to be here on this subject. So, I was on a call yesterday with a group discussing New York City's return from COVID. And so Henry Cisneros, who's a former HUD official, said, New York City is a place that works economically. And, he was giving a sort of a big picture analysis of where he thought New York City was in terms of coming back from COVID. But when we think about the micro level where most of us are living and working, we really have to ask, well, who does New York City work for? Who are the winners and who are the losers? And when I began as a political activist in West Harlem, I was a Democratic district leader. I was really working to bring a new kind of political activism into the community. The activism I had seen as the public relations person for the first Jesse Jackson for President campaign. And it was an opportunity to really work with delegates. Back then, anybody could run as a delegate. And so there were young people running to be a delegate all over the city. And so I was able to travel with my mentor, Bill Lynch, all over the city, and to really begin to understand how different neighborhoods had different benefits, different challenges, and different levels of activism and advocacy. So when Bill Lynch said to me, do you want to be behind the scenes or out in front? Why don't you think about running for district leader in West Harlem? I took that opportunity, and it turned out that the first issues that community residents, mostly female senior citizens who were really kind of running everything in West Harlem, they said to me, it's really your turn for a new generation to really begin to help us organize and bring the important issues to the forefront in this community. And it just so turned out that those first issues that they brought to me were issues of air quality and environmental quality. And so really understanding that, communities that are low income, we have a lot of social service organizations, but we don't have advocacy systems in our communities. We don't have the support and the nonprofits that can really work to organize residents, to tell their stories, to have a voice in the halls of power. And so I began a volunteer organization called We Act out of my Democratic club to work on issues of sewage treatment plants and diesel buses that were really fueling the asthma epidemic in the late 80s. And so after we were able to sue David Dinkins and my friend, a family friend who my father grew up with in Trenton, New Jersey, we sued David, and he said, we're going to fix this plant, and we're going to make sure it's a good neighbor to the community. And so I had the opportunity to go back to what I was doing. I had a full-time job, and we decided, well, no, we need to institutionalize advocacy in this community. And so that's really how I got involved in this work. And, I really began to think about issues of empowerment. And so in the late 90s, when Congressman Charles Rangel was sponsor of the Empowerment Zone bill, it was a bill around economic revitalization. And it was supposed to be there to assist residents who were living in areas with the highest concentration of poverty, as indicated by then the 1990 census. And it was there to bring business investment, to create jobs, to support cultural investments. And it ended up, leveraging about $1.1 billion in private capital and about $242 million in direct investment. But what the Empowerment Zone actually did was to bring in big box stores along 125th Street, displace mom and pop shops, displace nonprofits who couldn't afford the new square foot prices. You couldn't, my organization had been on 125th Street for 15 years. And then all of a sudden, we just really couldn't afford, we could no longer afford the square footage. We were competing with Applebee's restaurant for space. And so there were really no arrangements made to develop a building to really house displaced nonprofits, which also provided jobs, and in some cases, more jobs than some of the small donut shops and other stores that came in with all kinds of incentives. And so we now have a new series of empowerment zones called opportunity zones. And I'll just say that provides tax incentives for businesses to locate in underinvested areas like East Harlem. So East Harlem is an opportunity zone. Yet there's no provision for community consultation on what businesses and services are needed and where. So I just wanted to kind of tee up that conversation and certainly later talk a little bit more about some of the structural issues and how we can really reimagine how we engage in terms of economic revitalization and affordable housing. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Peggy. Unclear whether we're stuck here. It seems like there's a problem with the reception, but we're going to go on to Yolande. And before we do, I just want to highlight this very important theme you raised, Peggy, of the significance of rebuilding the city through advocacy systems, that we don't have advocacy systems in our communities that can in fact tell our stories and our aspirations. Yolande, can you give us a sense of your personal background? What brings you to this work? And what kinds of advocacy in the law have you been working with? Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again to Dr. Kim West and to Professor Fernandez for hosting this really important, relevant chat at this time. I wasn't expecting that loaded question, so let me see how I could summarize. There's so many things that brought me to this work. While you asked the question earlier, you know, I come from a family of service. We grew up in the Caribbean. My mother and her sisters and my grandfather were teachers and nurses, and we grew up in the mountain village up in Grenada, and we grew up out of a village of slavery and a village of African people who wrestled up what little they had and educated their children and themselves. And I ended up at Columbia Law School. I thought initially my passion was poetry and political science. Little did I know that I'll come full circle to what I view to be a civil rights initiative. Housing has to be a civil rights initiative. But after leaving Columbia, Columbia is a very market-driven school. We learned a lot about corporate finance, and you know, I ended up on Wall Street as an attorney, and that experience was very eye-opening because I got to actually be in the throes of what runs this economy, and to look at how the 1 to 10% financed themselves and worked on some of the biggest deals that they were at the time, and realized that in a period of time when, you know, the whole economic discussion was about trickle-down economics, right? That it will trickle down, whether it's trickling down through the empowerment zones or through tax policies, and then you did ask the question, what personally brought me to this work? You know, that rise took me to an economic status that I thought I know that my family didn't imagine, or I could have even, you know, imagined being truly middle class for a while financially. And then I got laid off. Racism played it always reared its dark head in terms of how much you earn. And here I was working on these very complex structured deals. And when I got laid off, right around, I was actually, if you look it's actually in the Law Journal, my colleagues and I were about the first of the Wall Street attorneys to be laid off at the beginning of what became the Great Recession. And I realized in dealing with my own mortgage that here I was, a high-end, highly educated, highly experienced corporate finance attorney, and I couldn't talk to my own bank where I was an employee rationally. And I committed myself that I'm going to use my knowledge and experience to help working families who we knew at the time all the reports were there, and all the reports have been confirmed that the credit markets went away, the job markets went away, and the old saying, which has been said a lot of time, when Wall Street gets a cough, Harlem gets pneumonia, that the pneumonia was well on its way. And I entered this work at a period of time when the first thing that really got me was when Wall Street ran up to the Treasury and Washington and said, "Oh, we've got to bail out the homeowners," and the bailout was really designed to bail themselves out, but the products through which mortgages, consumer mortgages, subprime mortgages, the products through which they were financed were, in their minds, so complex that I sensed that they were even pulling a wool over Congress's eyes. So I got involved with, at the time, Congressman Ed Towns, who became the head of the Oversight Committee, and he invited me to write a white paper on what I thought was the solution at the time. And from that era, we went into, the HAMP program of the Obama plan. But I'm just going to fast forward and say what the commitment that I have now to this work is that the work has taught me that there's no commitment to working middle class African American families. And I say working middle class versus working class. I'm talking about nurses and doctors and teachers and just your basic, there used to be this sort of pride that I'm middle class while we're all still living on credit cards. That's not who I'm talking about. I'm talking about the people who are in Harlem and who are in Bed-Stuy and who are in Detroit and who are in Dayton, Ohio, who have run this economy by paying taxes after running this economy by being slaves and after running this economy by doing sharecropping. And now, so I'm really committed to having this system deliver on its promise for the pursuit of happiness. And the model for that they've created was home ownership. And we've just got to adopt and embrace home ownership as a civil right. And it's the work that I do in the defense bar. It's the work that I do in my practice. It's the work that I do in the community, that African American people in particular, and that's not to include Latinx that don't consider themselves African American or broaden their definition, but the efforts and programs and laws that brought us to where we are today was specifically designed to exclude people of African descent. And we need to get to a point to really understand the full scope of that racism, that structural racism, and come up with and call on our governments to lift the boat of people, and then everyone else will be lifted. So that's how I come to this work. I don't know if that's a personal story enough, but and going into one of the things that is becoming evident, and it was alluded to in the beginning, there are always all these fancy programs. They're all window dressing programs. They're the commitment to having Black and brown people own their homes, support them in owning their homes, creating an environment that respects their communities. We're creating an environment that subsidizes, supports financially, because it's been done for every other group, so that they can pursue the American dream of economic stability for themselves and their children is my work mission until the good Lord decides I'm off this planet. So thank you for being here.
I've lost you for a minute there. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
And I did hear part of your story, your personal story of coming to this work because you're part of a family of servants.
Service for community service providers.
Yeah, absolutely. Servants to the community, that is.
Yes.
I'd like to, an incredible story, and that you too were displaced.
I am still displaced, actually.
And even as an attorney, a top-notch attorney, you were not able to gain access to what you needed in that process. I'd like to turn to Dr. Mindy Fullilove for just a brief introduction of your work and what has brought you personally to this work of displacement.
Yeah, hi, good to be here. I got involved in studying displacement because I was looking at the AIDS epidemic. I started studying the AIDS epidemic in 1986, and in 1988 read a really groundbreaking paper by Roderick Wallace called Synergism of Plagues. And what he showed in that paper was the way in which the New York City policy called planned shrinkage, which closed fire stations in minority neighborhoods, had led to the burning of buildings and the displacement of populations. And with that displacement of populations had really spread AIDS throughout minority communities in New York City. And the epidemic in New York became a powerful engine for the worldwide AIDS epidemic. But my background is as a psychiatrist, and I didn't really understand the connection between being displaced and then AIDS risk behaviors, sex, drugs. So I really wanted to understand that more. And so that's been my work over the past long time.
Our work on root shock has been pivotal in really deepening our understanding of the complex ways in which root shock and displacement affect all of our communities, our health, our bodies, our minds, the infrastructure of our families. Peggy, I'd like to come back to you. And Dr. Mindy Fullilove, since you've just joined us, part of what we are seeking to do in this first part of the discussion is to deepen the audience's conversation of the structures of displacement. We will follow that with a conversation of the experience, and then we'll end with a conversation about the possibilities of rebuilding the city. Peggy, can you talk to us a little more about the contemporary origins in the city of displacement? What were the empowerment zones and how exactly did they transform our communities in the 1990s?
Well, I think we found our elected officials, as I mentioned, our Congressman Charles Rangel co-sponsored the Empowerment Zone, which really began to transform 125th Street. At the same time, or a little prior to that, under Mayor Koch, we had, I don't know the percentage, but we had a very large percentage of Harlem brownstones that were in REM and under city management. And so the city began to stockpile these in REM buildings. And sometime towards the latter part of the Koch administration, they began to sell them off. And that began a small wave of gentrification, people moving further uptown, some from the west side, some new people to the city, and beginning to buy up some of the brownstones. Then again, we had the economic investment from the empowerment zone that brought stores and brought new jobs into the community and began to support new business entrepreneurs who were not necessarily indigenous to the community. So while mom and pop stores were being displaced, we had new business entrepreneurs being supported to come into the community. And so we began to see more gentrification from a more affluent group of people moving up uptown into Harlem. I think we also have been able to see the expansion of Columbia University's campus into West Harlem. They're calling it the Manhattanville campus. And that was basically in 8 years of reaching out to the community with their sort of dog and pony show and talking about the campus they were going to create. And so it was really important for the community to push back and begin to develop some of its own planning for how they thought Columbia University, which turned out to own most of the 80% of land that it was going to expand into, how it would really interact with Columbia as a close neighbor. And so there was about a 6-year advocacy campaign with a variety of advocates, primarily in West Harlem and Washington Heights, really working to push Columbia to not fence off Broadway with their new campus, and to develop certain kinds of protocols in terms of deliveries, in terms of job development. And so that community benefits agreement, which resulted from these discussions and negotiations with Columbia, ended up as a $150 million fund with the West Harlem Local Development Corp, with New York City, Bloomberg at that point, putting in another 150 million for affordable housing, because Columbia's expansion was going to basically, level several affordable housing buildings in that area. And so those folks had to be relocated. And so the city did make monies for that to be available. Of course, given the fact that there was so little available land left in West Harlem, that affordable housing actually did not get developed in West Harlem, in that neighborhood, for the people who lived there. So just thinking structurally about how we spend so much of our tax money in economic and tax incentives for businesses and developers to locate in communities, and to develop services and businesses in communities without ever speaking to anyone in a community or engaging as to what those actual community needs are. So we've seen 2 major grocery stores leave, Pathmark and now Fairway. And of course, we've got Whole Foods, which is very expensive. We've seen those grocery stores go, but now we have an opportunity zone in East Harlem, and literally you could get a tax incentive to put up a hot dog stand. So what do East Harlem folks need? We actually know, because there was a whole rezoning process that lasted 2 years, and there's almost 100 pages of recommendations for what the community wanted. And it was a very structured process of committees and really focusing on land use and zoning and housing and small business. And literally, once the city council voted to rezone East Harlem, the 100 pages of recommendations from the community, I don't know where they went, but they might as well have gone in the trash, because they were not revived or implemented. And so it's really up to the advocacy community to really be the ones to push equitable development. But of course, we'll talk a little bit about that later in terms of re-envisioning the city. But certainly the the idea that we look at planning for our city in silos. Well, this is the economic silo, economic development. The housing development is here. Other kinds of development are in another box. And again, none of that comes together so that we have an equitable, sustainable, healthy community.
Thank you, Peggy. I'd like to bring Dr. Mindy Fullilove into this conversation now. And I'm just reminded that it was in the 1990s that this new frontier for capitalist development in Harlem emerges. It's a kind of development that proposes to produce mostly low-paid service jobs with absolutely no benefits. At the same time that the largest employer in Harlem, you might recall, Harlem Hospital, is experiencing a gutting process because of the budget cuts, right? So, and this was also a moment when there was the massive transfer of wealth from the bottom of society and the middle class and working class to the top was on its way. Dr. Mindy Fullilove, would you add to this conversation on the structural roots of displacement?
Yeah, glad to. I think that the story actually goes back to the 1950s, so that there's 40 years before you get to the 90s when various pieces of this are being put in place. And at that time, Harlem had some important radical leaders. And so McCarthyism comes in and those radical leaders get wiped out. Some get deported, others get sent to prison. And so basically the commitment to on the part of the political leaders to the grassroots is shifted. That's one piece of it. Then that's followed in rapid succession by urban renewal, which takes out parts of the community and parts of New York City. It's followed by deindustrialization. So people that have good union jobs are losing them. The Regional Plan Association promotes the idea that New York City shouldn't have any factories. All the factories should get pushed somewhere else. So union jobs are disappearing. Then there are a whole series of epidemics, none of which are properly managed. We're seeing this kind of impropriety now with COVID, but it's been going on in Harlem for a long time. So there was a heroin epidemic, then a crack epidemic, then a violence epidemic, multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, a long list of epidemics, all of them badly managed, so that people suffered morbidity and mortality at very high rates. Then you get into planned shrinkage. So Harlem loses 30% of its built structure, its buildings, between 1960 and 1990, which is catastrophic for the social organization and the social strength of the neighborhood. And so at the point at which we get to the 1990s, Harlem is really very chaotic as a place. It's very, very difficult. 30% of the housing is gone. There's, rats and garbage everywhere. People are sick with AIDS, with addiction. It's at that point that Doctors McCord and Freeman publish a paper that points out that a black man in Harlem has a less life expectancy than a man in Bangladesh, which is at that point the poorest country on earth. So this sort of shocking disparity of health is showing up at that point. So that at that point the neighborhood is politically weak and has there are many organizations, but they don't really have the kind of power that existed in the community in the 1950s. So how does the community defend itself? It's not really able to defend itself. It's not even able to take care of itself. So it's a long time coming. When Roger Starr talks about starting planned shrinkage, he said, let's clear the land where the poor people are, clear it, and let it lie fallow until we know what we want to do with it. So he was not asking the people in the neighborhood, and he was really literally burning down their housing. So the recent film Decade of Fire, which I'm sure you've seen, which is more about the Bronx, which is about the Bronx, but it's the same story in Harlem. So this is catastrophe on catastrophe on catastrophe. And I'm not sure if that answers your question, but sort of like this whole series of upheavals have torn the social fabric and left people incredibly vulnerable to sickness and to death.
Thank you, Dr. Fullilove. That definitely paints a picture for us. Can you tell us a little more about the infrastructure of planned shrinkage, and how did the individuals behind this idea get away with it? Because I'm not sure that our listening audience understands the ABCs of this process, its genesis. Just give us a little more detail on that.
So planned shrinkage is implemented in the middle of the 1970s. The idea is that New York City is losing population, and the proposal is made that they should shrink the footprint of the city. And they're going to do this in minority neighborhoods. So they're going to pick neighborhoods that they think are flourishing and keep them, and then close fire stations in other neighborhoods and let them burn down, move the people, and the people will then move to the neighborhoods that they're going to save. Roger Starr, who's one of the architects of this in city government, says at the time that he predicts that New York City in the future will have a population of 5 million people. Obviously, he missed the boat. So how they got away with this is, to me, really one of the great questions. How do you burn down the city by, malign neglect of, closing fire stations? And this was known. There were hearings in the New York State Assembly about this. So the fighters unions were protesting this. It was well known that this was happening, yet somehow it was argued that this was okay. And what's also really fascinating to me is, as you were saying, people who are listening might not know, if you ask people in New York or anywhere, but in New York, what happened in the Bronx, what happened in Harlem, they would say the landlords committed arson. They wouldn't say there was a public policy of planned shrinkage. And even today, when people are recounting the history of that period, they don't say there was planned shrinkage. So not only did they not get called out on it then, they've managed to keep it a secret, like covert, like a covert operation, which is really stunning. And one of the problems with it being a covert operation is that then planners can go into other cities. They can go into Detroit, they can go into Youngstown and say, well, planned shrinkage is a really great idea. Let's do that. And the costs of it are just pushed aside. Like, no, it's a great plan. There's no problem. But planned shrinkage is crucially connected to the spread of AIDS. Dr. Roderick Wallace estimates it killed 100,000 people. So it's a horrific policy. It was kept pretty much under wraps at the time and has remained that way. I don't know how you take the lid off and really get planned shrinkage into the conversation. I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely. Now, Dr. Fullilove mentioned this successive waves of displacement and horror in the city that targeted specific communities, Black American, Puerto Rican, other immigrant communities. And the latest wave we saw during the deep recession of 2008. And while we understand to some extent the ways in which homeowners in New Jersey were disproportionately displaced, Black and brown homeowners, we know less about homeowners in New York City and the ways in which that displacement through foreclosure is happening. Yolande, can you talk us through that experience? How is that experience on the ground?
Well, I don't know. Maybe this is a good time for us to show the picture of what that experience has resulted in the ground, using Brooklyn as an example. I hope everyone can see this. This is a chart that shows the top line is a red line. And we all know, coming out of the civil rights movement in the 60s and the 70s, and the energy and the optimism of that period, Black home ownership increased exponentially. But before that, I think my colleagues on this panel have alluded to it, as well as you, Dr. Fernandez, that African Americans have always owned homes. Even when there was no credit available to them, they've saved, especially in places like Bed-Stuy, Crown Heights. When Caribbean immigrants came to New York in the 40s and 50s, people came up from the South, and so they had homes, and a lot of the homes had very small mortgages or no mortgages. And even though there was extensive redlining, which meant to deny them access to conventional bank credit, they bought homes. And those very same lines that were used by the federal government and the banks to cordon off where our families would not get actual mortgages, those lines were used to target subprime lending in the 90s and leading up in the years of the 2000s to now, because these homes had a lot of equity. A lot of these homes in Harlem and Bed-Stuy and Crown Heights, people were sitting on maybe $100,000 in mortgage, or 200,000 or 250, while the houses were worth at the time 750 or 850. Again, there was a lot of racism built into the valuation of the homes, because once it's an all-Black community, it's worth 750, and by the time it starts, a couple of white people move in or supported for them to move in, it goes up to $1 million. But even so, this chart shows what happened as a result, we believe, as a result of foreclosure, when it was at its height in the last 5 years, when it took off with full steam. And you asked me before to talk a little bit about the illegalities or what causes this. And you could see the dip, the just slide down of Black home ownership, and the corollary or the proportionate slide up of white home ownership. And it's not that African Americans, and when I say African Americans, I include all of us. Like I say, it's not that we don't want white people living next to us, but these owners predominantly are investors that are coming in and buying these properties in the courtrooms, in foreclosure proceedings, where the foreclosures are based on spurious documents, if not illegal documents, if not fraudulent documents. Because during the subprime run-up, when there was a lot of subprime lending, and just to tell everybody what it means real quickly, it was lending made through mortgage brokers and mortgage bankers who were not tied to conventional banks and conventional standards by choice. And they were not backed at the time by the federal government guarantee, which really backed home ownership after World War II, all the way in to the subprime era for white families. And white families expanded in that definition over time. It was first the settlers, and then the Europeans who came over, and everyone wanted to be called as white as possible, because that gave them access to the bank, except African Americans could not just walk into a bank and say, I've become white, and get credit. But this is what happened to home ownership. And I don't know, Dr. Fernandez, if this is a time for me to go through the presentation to further answer your question. But in the past 10 years, foreclosures has been the fuel or the engine that has really divested, by choice, by design, Black and brown communities, but in particular, African Americans. And if we can go to the next slide, I'll try to go through it quickly. This was what New York City looked like coming into 2013 in terms of mortgages in foreclosure. The darker the red line, the higher percentage of mortgages that were in foreclosure. So in terms of the amount of mortgages in that neighborhood, you're getting up to 15-20% of those mortgages being in foreclosure. And once you map those neighborhoods or joined in closer, you're looking at Central Brooklyn, Black communities, the Bronx and Harlem communities, Queens communities, and interestingly, the farm communities out in Suffolk County. So that's how we got in here. If you could go to the next slide. And so everybody heard that, when President Obama came in, and again, we're not going to get political because President Obama just really adopted what was left by the Bush administration and the bailout. There was all these HAM programs, and everybody thought everybody was going to get a modification. I am completely convinced that everybody would have gotten a modification if a lot of people from Maryland to Detroit to Brooklyn to California were not Hispanic American or African American. So you had the program 2009 to 2015, where the federal government had a modification program, but it wasn't mandatory. It was discretionary. And all the big banks played games in the courtrooms across the state and across the country. They had investor protections and investor restrictions, and no one actually, at the end of the day, when the special inspector for TARP, for the Troubled Asset Relief Program, looked back, less than 20% of homeowners got a modification under the very, highly touted Obama plan. And then in Brooklyn, we believe, and in New York City, we believe it was less than 10. And so the courts, in our view, knowing that, also got involved in accommodating these investors coming into court to foreclose on these mortgages after they did not give modifications. I'm being very general, so we don't get too in the weeds about it. And so that's why that chart happened, because the courts became almost like a clearinghouse and of foreclosures, using foreclosures to remove people from their homes, people who would have qualified for a loan modification. I'm talking about teachers. I'm talking about police officers. I'm talking about New York City civil servants, New York State civil servants, professors. These are all our clients, people making $70,000, $80,000, $90,000, even $120,000. And this map shows, the red dot shows you that the proportionate amount of Black families across the city in foreclosures compared to white families, which is the blue dot. Hispanic families is the sort of greenish grayish dot. Asian Americans, but we caught the pneumonia. So if we could go to the next slide, this slide just really shows how, if everyone remembered, back in 2009, 2010, there was all this optimism because there was a indication that there were 5 million families at least across the country that would be affected by the recession and the foreclosure crisis. And HAMP was going to come in and modify at least, 50 to 60% of those. Well, this is what happened. This chart just shows here how many people were denied. By the time you got to 2015, 4 million families out of the 5 million were denied. And really, we don't know where the 1 million is. I mean, here in New York and in the work we do, very few homeowners got the New York, the federal government's HAMP modification, and a lot of families were put into what I call predatory modifications, where it was called a modification, but it was structured for the next crisis for them to fall behind again, or there was a big amount put at the end of the loan so that by the time they were finished paying it in 20 years, they were essentially a renter. But if we go to the next slide, I just want to and thank you for doing this. So these were the big banks that were involved at the time that were committed to the Department of Treasury and to the federal government and to Congress. And in New York State, we have laws that said they had a good faith duty to come into court and provide a modification or a workout. And they just played games. So you had City Mortgage denying 80% of homeowners, JP Morgan denying 84%, Bank of America 80%. And when I say homeowners, that includes a lot of co-op owners. We've lost so many Upper Manhattan, Harlem. They're the silent majority. No one reached out to them. Because they were victims of or subject to what's called non-judicial foreclosures. And they really got no help. So we lost a lot of community equity, a lot of community value that's unaccounted for in these foreclosures. If we could go to the next slide. This is almost these slides, some of them have been prepared by Legal Services of New York City and have allowed me to use them. But you could see that 53.9% of the foreclosures in the courts in New York City, which were 10,531, that was around 2015. Half of those were African-American families. Next slide. Next slide is, and then what was so shocking, you know, it never ends, the attack or the targeting, if you go back since the Civil War, of African-American communities that are beginning to grow, whether you're looking at Tulsa, you're looking at, you know, as Dr. Mindy talked about, you know, these plans that happened in the 70s, enter New York City with the TPT seizures and in-rem foreclosures. You know, Dr. Peggy Shepard talked about this initially, of all the in-rems, right? And what happened when these families went with good faith with New York City to become cooperative or homeowners in the 70s and 80s and 90s, when they were abandoned by their landlords and left without heat and hot water, and the city seized the buildings for taxes and then set them on a path after they took care of the buildings. And then the city decided to take them back. And they used this program called the Third Party Transfer Program. And they're partnering up with nonprofit developers and real estate developers to transfer back those what's called affordable housing cooperatives, which are a lot of them in Harlem. There are a number of them in Brooklyn, back to the city and to their friends by calling them distressed properties, by designating that if they own 15%, well, right now there's, if you owe taxes, they can designate, and you have a health and safety hazard on the building, they can designate you distressed and put you in rem. Now, in rem foreclosure it's a non-judicial foreclosure. It's an expedited foreclosure where, but what the city has been doing is saying, if there's a property sitting on the block that's property number one that's distressed, we can take all the rest of the properties on the block and designate them as distressed. So let's go to the next slide. If you don't mind going to the next slide. Yeah, so we can go to the other slide, but the city has admitted that it is doing this TPT program to recapture back the HDFC program, the buildings that you were talking about, Dr. Shepard. And the city has also admitted that it focused its efforts on neighborhoods in the city where there were high foreclosure rates by banks and investors. So if you remember the first map with all the red dots, so any Black family, any Black block, any Black neighborhood, any Black community is sitting prey. When the City Council's Oversight Committee looked at this program last year, there were 420 properties taken at the end of 2017. Interestingly, none were taken in Staten Island, 10 were taken in Queens, 86 were taken in Manhattan, 152 were taken in Brooklyn, and 132 were taken in the Bronx. And the ones in the Bronx in particular and in Manhattan were HDFC cooperatives that the city actually had a duty to have succeed. But instead of helping them succeed, in my view, they've set them up to fail, and now they're grabbing them back and passing them on to so-called nonprofit developers to do so-called affordable housing. Let me just talk for a minute about the farce of affordable housing. Affordable housing is not affordable for working families. It's not intended to be affordable for working families. Affordable housing is using city tax dollars and city subsidies to build housing, and then they say, we'll do 80-20 or 60-40, meaning we'll give 60% to middle class and upper middle class and 40% to low income. No one's attending, or 20% to low income. No one's attending to the families that are making 41% AMI in their neighborhoods to 80% AMI. They're all now living in the homeless shelter in high numbers because, as you said, Dr. Shepard, you said it, Dr. Fernandez, that's the reason there are 25 million applications and 4 million, did you say, spots? Because the developers are just
40 million.
40 million. The developers get away with just saying to the city, well, we'll do a sliver of affordability and you turn your back and let us just overprice the rest of the apartments, 80% of them or 60% of them or 90% of them. And the city is quite comfortable looking the other way when they charge $6,000 for a 2-bedroom in Brooklyn or $4,000 for a 2-bedroom in Harlem, knowing that our families, our children, our friends, ourselves cannot afford these. And and it's not affordable, and that's a fuel of further displacement and gentrification. So if we could go to the next slide. So this is the type of building that they're coming back from. These were the type of buildings that were put into the HDFC program and bigger. There are a number of on St. Nicholas Avenue. There are so many of them in Harlem, so many hardworking Black families that did sweat equity to keep up these buildings over time, and the city is taking them back now. Next slide. I just want to not. These were all the locations of the HDFCs. The HDFC means Housing Development Funding Fund Corporation. They were supposed to be low to median income affordable cooperatives in buildings that the city took years ago when landlords had abandoned them and abandoned the tenants, and the city took them in rent, and then the city came up with this program to do this. But now they're taking them, this is what they're targeting, taking them all back. So next slide. I just want to go through this quickly. So at the end of 2017, the New Economy Project looked at what we call in New York State pre-foreclosure filings. There's a requirement that banks and loan services and investors, if they're going to foreclose on a 1-to-4 family, a co-op home, they're required to file a notice with the Department of Financial Services. From that notice, you can get a sense of what the climate is. But when we got to the end of 2018, coming into 2019, the amount of filings of pre-foreclosures were at the same level of 2009 in terms of volume. There were 167,848 pre-foreclosure notices across New York State. So, more than 150,000 families or 60,000 were about to enter foreclosure if they move forward. Half of those in the city were in Queens. Yes, that's a good idea. In New York City, Queens, Brooklyn, and the Bronx. But the predominant number were in African American communities and Hispanic American communities in the city. 31% of pre-foreclosure notices were going to neighborhoods in, as you see here on the left, Bushwick, East New York, and almost 2/3 of the notices were sent to people of color. What happens when that happens? If the foreclosure case were to begin, and you have banks and investors who are allowed by the courts to disregard the law to try to modify the mortgage, or disregard their good faith effort to try to modify the mortgage to keep that family in their home. And now that there's no federal program, the federal program on the prior administration and the prior Congress went away in 2015. These families are looking at losing their homes to foreclosure eventually and being displaced. Because once a family, especially in the outer boroughs, lose their home, Most of the homes are 1 to 4 family. They've got tenants or extended families living with them who've been living with them for a long time. They can't afford the rents because we're now in a, what we call a gentrified community, but the zoning laws are allowing all this buildup, and these affordable housing programs are not affordable to working families, and they're ending up in the homeless shelters. So next slide, if you don't mind.
Yolande, I think it's important for us to move on now so that we
Right.
can
So that's yes.
open up discussion shortly. I think we need to get to the possibilities of this moment.
Right. So
This
let
is
me
a
just right. So
this is
that's
a,
where I wanted to close by saying we are now in a crisis because our families are in high numbers in the homeless shelters. We need to recognize that.
Mm.
We need to recognize that there are over 60,000 families sleeping in the homeless shelter every night who go to work every day, and they can't afford to find a place in the city to live. And a lot of them are homeowners. They've lost all their equity, and they're sliding down into the track of poverty.
Thank you. And I've been looking for some statistics that I had pulled up, but my computer has literally died on me. The need for very low income housing in New York City is apparently 43%. So 43% of the city is in need of low income housing, which gets to some of what you were suggesting, that low income housing in many instances is actually not affordable for a huge chunk of the city's population. I want to ask Peggy and then Mindy, what does taking back the city look like in this moment of possibility? We've been through an apocalyptic moment in New York City with COVID, and many people have left the city. In many ways, the failed state became visible to the world, and certainly to New Yorkers. Does this moment present possibilities, and what kinds of work have you been doing, Peggy, that we can bring into this period?
Yeah, I think the disproportionate number of deaths of people of color, primarily Black Americans, from COVID-19 has really put a light on where we live, our zip codes, the fact that we also live with very high levels of air pollution, which made Black Americans more susceptible to high mortality and morbidity numbers. I think at the same time, the Black Lives Matter demonstrations have really woken some people up. So I think we have a small window of opportunity. We hopefully, I was asked not to talk about politics, but we do have an election next year for mayor and city council. And it's going to be very important that that the advocacy community residents make their needs known, and that we are supporting people who understand the issue from our perspective and who are going to develop a plan to address it. I believe that equitable development is really necessarily led and fueled by aggressive civic engagement. But of course, over the years, we've seen from philanthropy that groups headed by people of color and women of color get less money, in some cases less than 1% of all of the funds given in a particular sector. They get less money than others. So again, I started out talking about the lack of advocacy institutions in our community, and that's one of the reasons that there is so little funding and support for those. I talked about the empowerment zone earlier, and they are supporting arts and culture groups and other kinds of businesses that that add jobs. But at the same time, when I was in the empowerment zone, my organization added more jobs than the businesses across the street on 125th that got the incentives. So again, the advocacy and nonprofit communities, the legal services communities are not getting the kind of support that we need to really support the civil society. We have to have a stronger civil society, and we see more emerging young leaders who understand that and are trying to walk into that breach. But again, we've got to support that advocacy. We've got to stop as Black people, some of whom are not radical, stop thinking that protesting and negotiation is something, that they don't want to do. It's something that's critical for us to do. And so I think there are some examples, some small examples. Melrose Commons in the Bronx got together with businesses, and they were really able to, I think it's called We Stay Nos Quedamos. They were able to develop a sustainable model of housing and small businesses. We've got Lenox Terrace now, which the owner is going to infill and build, I don't know, 4 or 5 new towers. They're rezoning the whole commercial area. That would be an opportunity to really have a new kind of negotiation around some of those issues. I'm not sure that that's going to happen. So I would say one way to keep housing affordable is through the new energy economy. My organization at WeAct, we have been installing solar panels on 14 HDFCs, which Yolande talked about earlier, because energy bills are one of the largest expenses of buildings. And if we're going to keep affordable and mid-income housing really affordable, we've got to get to energy savings and a new energy future. I think also we have been training underemployed people, over 100 in Harlem, to do solar installations. And so they are actually the ones that we have gotten our installation companies to hire to do those installations. And some of those young men we've been training, at least 12 of them, have developed a solar worker cooperative. They've incorporated, we're incubating them in our space, and they've gotten their first big contract. So there are some lights around here, but we've got 30 million households in this country who are energy insecure, who cannot pay the electric bill and pay rent and other bills that they need to pay. So again, when we start thinking about a new climate future and a new energy future, we've got to be engaged in that, because our bills are going to go up. The utility companies are trying to raise those bills to pay for the energy transformations. And so we've really got to be advocating that the most vulnerable among us have their bills subsidized. So there's just a whole variety of advocacy that we need to be engaged in as we really switch to a more energy efficient economy. And don't think that, oh, well, energy efficiency, that's in that sector and I don't do that. I don't know what that is. That's going to impact all of us. It's going to impact our economy, the cost of housing, and the cost of doing business. So those are just some of the things I would talk about. I think also we see up in Washington Heights, Inwood, where a lawsuit managed to stop the rezoning there. So again, there are instances of people coming together in a civic alliance to make something happen in their communities. And we just have to do more of that. We have to focus on institutionalizing community benefit agreements as a tool to engage with the development community so that they understand what the resident needs are. And so, again, I think there are a number of equitable development strategies that we can begin to address, but we've got to have city officials who are not going to sell us out.
Right.
Dr. Fullilove, can you take us back and give us a broader perspective on the possibilities for transformation, given the epic displacement that we can expect in the near future? I'm thinking about the conversation we had, and you talked about trauma.
Yolande made this incredible point, which is Black people have always owned houses. And the parallel point that people have always ripped the Black people off. And a lot of people talk about building wealth and they say, well, Black people need to buy a house. They need to know that they should buy a house. But Black people have always known they should buy a house, and they tried to buy a house and then they got it stolen. Urban renewal is one of the biggest systematic nationwide thefts of housing, but up until now. But with COVID, the numbers of people who are at risk of eviction, like people estimate, the estimates I've heard range from 23 million to 40 million. When you think about, it's incomprehensible. All right, if you got a drip of that, right? Yolande was saying we have 60,000 families now. What if we got a drip of that 23 million? There was utter chaos. So how does our society move in a sensible direction, and what is this about? So Yolande is talking about how do we do justice, and Peggy's talking about how are we sustainable, and I think it's those two ideas together. How do we start to think just and sustainable, that this is the way forward. And the problem is that it's like buying a house. Everybody knows you buy a house and you get some equity and it helps, but you can't do it if somebody comes and steals your house and you lose your equity. Similarly, everybody knows you're supposed to do advocacy and have political power, but if you lose your house and your community gets torn apart, how do you build political power? Because that comes from stable communities that are organized, and it takes a while to build political power, to build trust, get organized. So the so the real question is, here we are in a moment of profound crisis without really the social organization to get us out of crisis. So what happens in that situation? And I think, so the way I've been thinking about it is that it's not a moment when you can go outside and knock on people's doors and organize them, but some people are organized. And so part of it is, this is an asset-based community development approach for the organizations that exist to be lifting up a way forward and trying to get it out to their constituents, to try to work together to say what is the agenda going into in this crisis, coming out of this crisis, what's our agenda, and how do we influence policy using what we have, which is not what we need, but it is what we have. So I think it's around how does just and sustainable get articulated for all of us, and how does every organization say, okay, my piece of this just and sustainable is fill in the blank, whatever it is. That's my thought. I hope that's helpful.
Yes, we have the deputy mayor with us now, and we have approximately 7 or 10 minutes before we should open it up for a broader conversation. Deputy Mayor, welcome. Please chime in. And we're at the part of the conversation where we're seriously considering the possibilities for transformation. There are limits within which we're operating. We need just, and we need also to address elemental needs, but we also need to dream outside of the parameters and container of this society we're living in, which is producing an enormous amount of suffering. And what I think I want you to address, which perhaps you can, Mindy, later on, is that we've been through the war. I think there has to be an acknowledgement and a conversation about the fact that we've been through war in the city. Those apocalyptic scenes of those trucks outside of those hospitals in Queens are somewhere in our subconscious. And so I'll say before you speak, Deputy Mayor, that in 1860, abolitionists were considered lunatic. Literally. Lunatic, and their proposals to end chattel slavery were not part of mainstream discourse, and within 5 years, the institution had been dissolved. Of course, it came back in a different form, but can you talk to us about remaking the city substantially?
Well, thank you. I apologize for being late. There was a scheduling snafu. I would first of all say that I think across the country, not only in New York, if 10 years ago, 80% of large and medium-sized cities in the United States were majority Black, Latinx, and Asian, and I'm sure now that number is much higher. And if you add young urban white people, 80% of them voted for Obama twice, 80% of young white people in cities. So if you put that together with people of color, that is a potential coalition that can change America fundamentally. And that is the coalition that elected Bill de Blasio twice. That's the coalition that elected Barack Obama twice. And it has been electing progressive candidates across the country. And that's the rising tide. It's going to be a majority of this country in the not too distant future. So I think what that means is that substantial mega change will be on the agenda. I heard Peggy talk about energy efficiency. 900,000 buildings in New York need to be retrofitted for energy efficiency. It's a major, major thing. And it could be economically transformative for the people who do that work. Because we're talking about huge numbers of jobs, huge numbers of businesses and equipment and so forth. In addition to that, New York City has 520 miles of coastline. The oceans are rising. That is the science. And New York will have to be rebuilt, the infrastructure fundamentally. And that too is a major change. That's going to happen. And the question is it going to be done equitably or not? Public housing in New York has to be rebuilt, all of it. And that is a major, major change that's going to have to happen in the city. And other things are happening. The wealthier 60% of white American children of baby boomers are about to inherit somewhere around $50 trillion in the United States over the next 10 years. And unless something is done structurally, that will explode racial disparities in wealth and put tremendous pressure on folks' neighborhoods. I mean, we're worried about displacement now. What's coming is truly a tsunami. So I think in all of these ways, the opportunity exists, not even before we talk about COVID and how we recover from COVID. Big changes are on the horizon, and they're going to happen regardless. The question is, are they going to happen in an equitable way or not? And to that point, what Mindy was saying, I think, was right on point. right now, we do not have organizations or forums to working relationships amongst all the different groups that are needed in order to formulate an agenda and then insist in that agenda. We've had movements like Black Lives Matter, it's great, but I would agree we need to turn that into something more organized and systematic in order to deal with all of the challenges ahead of us. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to begin to take questions. Perhaps Sarah can field some of these questions for us. Part of what you suggest, Deputy Mayor, is in many ways a revolutionary transformation of the infrastructure of the city and the country. And last time there was a massive rebuilding of infrastructure was in the 1930s. And that was in part propelled by the largest strike wave in American history. That's what finally, I'm thinking of the second New Deal, not the first New Deal. The first New Deal was a bailout of the banks. The second New Deal was a series of policies for the people that only came because of the threat of a revolutionary situation led by labor in this country, which gets us to the kind of deeper organization in communities that Mindy, Dr. Mindy Fullilove is suggesting that we need to transform the city. So I just want to put that out there. How are we going to get there? Because part of what Yolande laid out and the statistics that the details you gave us, no one knows about this. Part of the underbelly of that is that corporate forces and realtors are really in control of the resources of our city. So I'm wondering, we're taking questions for the panelists. I'm wondering if any of you want to respond, perhaps to that which was laid out by the deputy mayor. And we do have one question. How does the deputy mayor suggest we get our city to build coalitions to support the Green New Deal?
I just wanted to say to the deputy mayor, besides hi, I think that my experience of working in various cities is that indeed there are a mass of young people across all races and ethnicities who understand and love cities and are a progressive force. I think you're highlighting that is really important because we start to think about all these statistics and it gets depressing. It's like, where is change going to come from? So I think your point about a coalition of young whites in cities and people of color is really, really helpful. And then the issue is how to help them how to help them focus on what is the sound agenda going forward. I think is really very helpful. Thank you so much, Phil, for throwing that in.
Well, Dr. Fernandez, I would say that those coalitions are going on in this country. There are numerous meetings around these issues. The problem is that they're in their own sector. I'm meeting with other environmental groups or other political folks, but we're not meeting with the affordable housing and the community development folks who think basically that they're the only ones who do community development. So we don't have a broad-based coalition. We're talking with like-minded people and trying to figure out how we're going to advance the goals and objectives that we've developed, but we have not developed them with a broad community.
May I just, I know we want
Yolande, yes.
I wanted to pick up a little bit on Deputy Mayor Thompson, just to share. As lawyers, we can't do it all in the court to get to justice. Everything we've achieved as African Americans in this country has been combined with advocacy and protest. And an example of that, or two examples of that are really instructive. Last year, the tenants group across the state, the downstate, got together and did the most amazing thing. They got the state assembly to change tenant laws and advance tenants' rights. And it was a real big movement of that didn't make it to the major news, but they showed once again, 50 years after the civil rights movement, what a coalition and advocacy can do in terms of legislation, or the same thing happened with TPT. When it came to light that the city was taking properties in this manner, we were trying to figure it out as lawyers, but the community in Brooklyn started with an advocacy. And there was already an advocacy going on by a coalition of HDFC owners in Upper Manhattan. And we're still fighting it out in court because court battles take forever to come. But as far as I know today, the city's not yet, it doesn't have the nerve to move forward with any take-ins until that's resolved. So I think it's really, really important that we highlight to those who are listening that at the very least, we saw what Black Lives Matter's done even coming out of George Floyd. We need to not be afraid. I think you said it, Peggy. We need to not be afraid of the protesting and advocacy that we will need to have to get to what you call to equitable distribution, because we really need to get to equitable distribution.
I'm hearing that the new city is going to demand the forming of coalitions and rebuilding of organizations at the level of the community. And I want to just acknowledge that in Philadelphia, a coalition of activists from across different areas of work launched a sit-in or an encampment in a wealthy district. And they were there for 3 or 4 months beginning in the summer. And they were threatened with eviction. This is an outdoor encampment. The police attacked them numerous times. They came back. And just recently, they were able to get the city to redistribute housing to that collective. But there are other questions here. And this is a really important question about gentrification, which the struggle against gentrification and displacement focuses on home ownership. What does stability in community look like for a city of renters? So I think there's a question about collective ownership, perhaps, of property. Who wants to take this question?
The Deputy Mayor, you want to take that question? Are you?
Why don't you start?
Well, I want to say two things about that question. First of all, first of all, I want to say we have to stop thinking about affordable as low income. I want to invite us all to start thinking about affordable as working families, not because there's that whole stereotype of, with all due respect, Deputy Mayor, of the progressive agenda, that if it addresses our test to the low income, then it can exploit and disregard the working family, especially the Black working family's efforts to get up the economic ladder. Now, and then going to the particular question, gentrification is such a superficial process, right? Because gentrification actually starts, I've learned from someone, by the city's rezoning an area and providing services to an area to make it more safe, to make it more comfortable, to make it more accessible. But the city never does that. I'm not talking about New York City itself, any city. It doesn't do that, generally speaking, when that community is predominantly Black. It does that to shift the complexion of the community, but pretending that it's only doing so economically. But fundamentally, the definition of gentrification historically It's creating ghettos and moving the Black people into those ghettos and moving them out of those ghettos, or as was done in, in Europe pre-World War II. I mean, so a city that needs to think about how it creates housing that's affordable for its residents to be vibrant, so artists can live here and young people can come and people can be writers and people can raise families, has to get rid of whatever is causing that superficial pricing that's making pricing affordable, especially when the government is facilitating that pricing through foreclosures, through policies, through partnerships with nonprofit developers, and through giveaways to big developers like the Rebney developers who can go on. The public-private partnership model is ruining communities and is ruining our city. I don't know if this actually answered your question, but gentrification is not the model.
Well, I would just agree that I think various forms of shared ownership, community ownership are very important to block displacement and also to enable working people and low-income people to actually have stability and some form of ownership of land. And I would just point out, the population of this country is growing every year, and land is not growing every year. And because of carbon, we're discouraging sprawl, which means we're encouraging more and more people to concentrate in cities. If ownership is left the way it is, it just means that landlords will be able to squeeze people with no limit and actually drain the future from young people who have to live in cities to work and who rents just kill them. So that is, again, there's pressure upon us to break with our traditional mold of, property ownership and to start thinking anew. So HPD is is already exploring different forms of ownerships in their RFPs. More opportunities for nonprofit and community ownership is something they're exploring. But we're going to have to do a lot more of that. Otherwise, we're just headed into true chaos.
I think we ought to separate ownership from displacement, because the history that Yolande has presented and that I've presented makes clear that ownership does not prevent displacement. And so to think that it does it's not consistent. We read about Tulsa, read about any African American community that went through urban renewal. People owned land. They owned it, and yet they were displaced. So ownership does not prevent displacement. Which I own a house, so I'm a favor of home ownership, but it doesn't prevent displacement. So how do we think about what makes communities stable? And the question, what does it look like? It looks like Paris. Paris is a city of renters, a gorgeous city. So how do we understand? You could have a city of renters that could be a fabulous city, but you have to have protections for renters. And then the question of how do you do that? It becomes the real question. The pressures on the land, the densification that lies ahead, that lies ahead. These are real, but it doesn't mean that you prevent displacement. So
I would say there are three tools. There's ownership, there's land use law, and there's finance that really affects what happens on real estate. I'm not pitting one against the other. I think we have to use all the tools that are available in order to try and deal with what we're facing. And the reason I mentioned finance, I just talked about $50 trillion being inherited by wealthy, upper 60% of white baby boomers. I think we have to be working on all these different fronts. I would agree with you. Any one approach is not a magic bullet.
Can you identify those three pillars again? Finance, land use law, and ownership, property ownership, and of which there are a variety of different ways of going at property ownership. But I'm just saying, those are the tools at play.
And I think we need strategies in each one of those areas. I agree with Mindy. You know, if you can't just rely on one. By the way, the Tennessee Valley Authority on the second New Deal electrified 5 states in the South, but only white farms. And it was a major cause of Black land loss. So how these things roll out, how they happen is key. You know, how we embed equity in all of these different processes that are happening is absolutely key, because we can get blown out of the water in the COVID recovery. We could get blown out of the water in the NYCHA rebuild. We can get blown out of the water as we think about energy and retrofits and all of that, unless equity is in there. And we have strategies to make sure it's done in an equitable manner. We can get blown out of the water with the sea level rise. Who gets protected? Who doesn't?
Peggy, do you want to come in on this?
Sure. You know, you mentioned finance, Phil, and, you know, there's a lot of green bank legislation being discussed in Congress now. And some of those folks who are at those think tanks are really beginning to consult with communities, consult with environmental justice folks. And if that does not happen and it's finance as usual, we already have a New York State Green Bank, and somehow they cannot seem to support smaller projects like community shared solar or other kinds of microgrids in the city. So if we're not embedding these tools that you've just mentioned with equity and with community, it's really business as usual. It's about, you know, market forces, and market forces have not done well by our communities.
So that's a question. How do we challenge market forces? How do we ensure that people get what they need, not just in terms of housing, but as Peggy suggested, there are many people across the country and in the city who are losing their homes because they can't afford to pay either their taxes or their energy bills. So where do market forces fit in this conversation?
Oh, sorry, Deputy. Yeah.
No,
I started out by saying that, you know, I had the privilege, I guess, or the opportunity to work on Wall Street. I'm not a big market forces person, but I do respect the question. I am a market forces person in that I believe, you know, there are markets that function, but markets don't function when they're not fair and they're not honest and they're not transparent. And they've never been fair, honest, and transparent when it comes to Black people and Black communities. And historically, I recommend this book, The Color of Money, that I'm deep in right now. And what she shows is that all markets that have succeeded for everyone else but African Americans were supported, created, structured by the federal government. So we've got to, we're still at incubation phase with these problems and these solutions, because we have yet to have the heart and soul of the federal government making a commitment to Black families succeeding through ownership or rental stability. If we go back to the first question that we got, you know, Mindy talked about Paris is a city of renters. We can do affordable renting if we stop giving away the 421A bond money to the big developers, and the city does it so that it makes a commitment that we could do 100% affordable in a building, not 80-20, where young families, especially young people who are coming out of college and creative. So I'm not sure, Dr. Fernandez, whether, you know, we should be looking at markets, because market economy has been our greatest enemy as Black people, and they've worked against us, and they're only successful for the upper 10% because they're not honest and transparent and designed to have us succeed. Now, can we create a new one that's honest? I think we first have to deal with the structural racism in the system that kept us out of it.
We have a question here about why are large developers getting benefits that they deny? That they deny or that are denied? And Brenda also, maybe we could call on her. She wants to speak of those on the ground who are organizing. I just want to, and we don't have a lot of time. I don't know if anyone wants to answer these questions, but I came back to New York City in the 1990s after I grew up in the city, but I was away for college and other things. And New York was in the process of being transformed into an outdoor mall, literally. I don't know, you all remember the New York, the fascinating, gritty New York of the pre-1990s period. Everything about New York, its culture, its character, its idiosyncrasies, has given way to market forces, even in the way it looks. So this is a real question that we have to address. Like, how can market forces be held at bay so that the city and its creativity and its people can be foregrounded, perhaps as renters?
I'd like to say, first of all, that the issue of huge numbers of individual families and small businesses not being able to pay their rent is market failure. And what's needed there is a government bailout. The market solution for that is for a big hedge fund to buy up all their properties and the hell with the people. That's unacceptable. We need a government to step in because these folks suffering because of a pandemic, not because they were irresponsible. They need a bailout. As far as the market goes, I would say one of the most powerful market forces in New York are labor unions. The city unions alone have over $200 billion in funds. The state has over almost $300 billion in funds, together $500 billion in workers' savings that they invest. And the big wealthy developers use their money. When Tishman Speyer bought Stuyvesant Town in 2006, they spent less than $30 million of their own capital and equity. The rest of the money, the other $5.2 billion, came from the New York City unions, the California unions, CalPERS, the Ontario Workers Union, Public Sector Workers Union, and the government of Singapore put in a little bit. That's where the money came from. It was labor capital. The big point, I think, was one Peggy raised earlier. People who work on housing advocacy don't talk to trade unions. People who are working on the environment and on public banks aren't talking to labor. We're not talking to each other. Because if we did, that would be the biggest thing that could happen in terms of our ability to affect how the market works in New York.
Would anyone else like to address this?
Yeah,
this question?
I would also say that, one of the issues of the support of the current federal administration is that there's less regulation. And when you have less regulation, you have more market forces. So command and control, ensuring that in financial empowerment zones or opportunity zones, there are mandates for certain kinds of consultation or community benefits. That's really the way to ensure that these things happen and that these needs are addressed. But people in business wants less regulation, and when that happens, the rest of us lose. I would also say that I have hoped in the past that when we've had elected officials who've been strongly supported by labor, that they would have convened these kinds of meetings and coalitions to ensure that underemployed people of color get a job in a union, to ensure that you could bring together the affordable housing folks, with the banking folks, with the labor folks, and so on. And that doesn't seem to happen. And
Well,
I don't understand why.
We just did an agreement. It was announced in August with the building trades because we talked to them. I talked to them. And they agreed voluntarily that 30% of all people on city-funded construction projects will come from zip codes with 15% higher levels of poverty or from NYCHA. And that will create 26,000 job openings in the next 4 years for people living in those communities. And we want state legislation so we can apply that formula to all city contracts, over $50 billion a year in city contracts. And that is something that I think is pretty transformative. And it came really just out of working together with labor to say, you got to open your doors to inner city young people. That's your future. That's who the future construction workforce is going to be if we're going to retrofit all these buildings and do all this other work that needs to happen in New York. And they agreed with that. And I would say, Peggy, we need to do a lot more of that. I would agree with you. It's work we all need to do. But the point is, don't just wait for an elected official to organize a meeting between housing advocates and labor unions and so forth. I mean, this is something you don't have to be an elected official to do.
Absolutely.
And yes, I'd like our elected officials to do it as well.
You're absolutely correct. You do not have to be an elected official, and some of us are trying to do some of those things with not a lot of support. But when you do have that kind of support and you do sit at the top, 8 years later, maybe too late.
okay, we have very little time left. I'd like to give the floor a couple of minutes to Yolande and Dr. Mindy Fullilove for closing remarks. And thank you, Peggy.
Dr. Mindy, would you mind if I go before you? Because I think you're much more
Yolande.
You're much more
please.
knowledgeable than I am. So I wouldn't dare. I think I'm going to start my closing by the last question. Because the last question, I think it was HDFCs and access to capital. And we went into a discussion about markets. Again, I want to come back to say, all of these things that we've been talking about and the example of foreclosures are indicative of the lack of commitment from the governments, federal, state, city, no matter who's in office, to really believe and support and lift the boat of African Americans in terms of creating value for themselves and for the community. So that question about the HDFC, the city as a model, I'm not attacking the city, I'm just using it as an indication. It would prefer to now look at these aging buildings and provide capital and structure and programs and partnerships and credit and bonds to private developers instead of to the African American families and leaders who've been living in those buildings, who are quite capable of structuring their financing. A lot of these people are city workers. They work in the controller's office, they work at transit, they're doing all the math. So I think we really have to get to, John, I'm not decrying markets. I'm just saying that we've been excluded from markets and we've been sort of hoodwinked into thinking that if there's a market happening over here, we can have a little bit of sliver of it. We need a commitment now after the 1619 project and where we are and 401 years later by this government to say that we need to ensure that African Americans could be a vibrant part of this capitalist endeavor or this democratic endeavor. And this is what we're going to do to create access to capital, credit markets without the racism and shore that up. Otherwise, we're just going to be coming up with another plan, and 15 years from now or 20 years from now, so we're going to be analyzing why it didn't work, in my view. I don't know. We're in a very critical stage, and coming out of COVID, it's going to be even worse, and we just need some solutions. So thank you for the opportunity to be part of it.
Thank you, Yolande. And as the deputy mayor said, there's a crisis, and we could emerge from this crisis in all kinds of different ways, worse than we are now. Dr. Mindy Fullilove.
I think that's a really good place to, as we're sort of summing up this conversation, that we're in a profound crisis, and we need a bailout. Phil's point that people aren't unemployed because they want to be unemployed. They're unemployed because we have to shelter in place so we don't all die. So the federal response to this has just been outrageous and unacceptable. But I think one thing that the city can do is actually Peggy's point about convene the organizations to help us get through this. American Psychiatric Association today pointed out how many people are suffering from anxiety and depression. They said build the mental health system, but that's actually not what people need right now. They need to know that all the organizations, the whole panoply of organizations is trying to take care of them. I think the city should convene that breadth of organizations, from grocery stores to banks to Boy Scout troops, everybody. It is possible for the city to do it very easily, not so easy to do from the grassroots. But if they do that, it really is a commitment to supporting democracy, which is what I think we need right now.
Thank you, Mindy Fullilove, Peggy Thompson. Peggy Shepard, sorry. I'm Peggy Shepard and Deputy Mayor Phil Thompson, and Yolande for your insights. I think that one of the major themes of this conversation was the importance of rebuilding our communities and our networks and our organizations and our families and neighborhoods, so that we might work in coalition, both in the city, but across the country. I'll just end by saying that I interviewed Dr. William Robinson this week, and he observed something that you might have observed as well, which is that during the COVID pandemic, we saw a revitalization of labor in ways that we hadn't seen before. Labor was out in the streets protesting. And there were also Black Lives Matter protests, and the two never came together. And so I think that one of the themes of this conversation, which was identified by Peggy, is that the environmentalists are integrally tied to the housing activists, and the labor is central to the running of the city and the country. And our different struggles really need to be knitted together if we are going to remake the city. But as Dr. Fullilove suggested, our communities have been disemboweled over the course of multiple waves of displacement. And so the question of how to rebuild the integrity of our communities, how to rebuild trust and organization at the local level is one of the assignments of our time. And Yolande, thank you for all of that incredible material you offered about home ownership among Black people in New York and other people of color, something that we don't often think about. So thank you all.
You're welcome. Thank you for guiding us through these 2 hours.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you to